Welcome to the Marvelous Middle Age Podcast, where we are building a community of people who are in the midst of midlife, sharing our stories and learning from each other along the way. Each week, I'll have a guest join me to discuss a topic that impacts our lives and touches on some aspect of midlife. We'll discuss relationships, transitions, health and well-being, parenting, careers, and more. My goal is to encourage and support you and help you thrive as you navigate this adventure of midlife. Join me here each week for the Marvelous Middle Age Podcast. This week, Kathy Good, who serves as the Senior Director of the Chris and Suzy DeWolf Family Innovation Center for Aging and Dementia, is joining me for part 3 of our conversation on caregiving. If you haven't listened to the first 2 episodes in the series, I would encourage you to go back and check those out. In this episode, Kathy and I discuss how caregivers can take care of themselves while caregiving. Caregivers face many challenges, and today we're going to focus on self-care and stress management, communication, and caregiving transitions and decisions. If you are a family caregiver, I hope this episode encourages you and offers tools you can use in your caregiving journey. Kathy Good, welcome back to the Marvelous Middle Age Podcast.
Thank you. Delighted to be here again.
Yes, again. We are recording here today on a beautiful, very hot summer Iowa day. And I'm just thrilled that you're back. Today we are going to be talking about some really important things. But before we get into that, could you just briefly reintroduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. I am the current Senior Director of the Chris and Suzy DeWolf Family Innovation Center for Aging and Dementia. Every time I say that, I go like, whew, got through that one more time.
That's a long title.
We're grateful. We're grateful to the DeWolf family. Exceedingly grateful, but that's a long title sometimes.
It is.
So, as a person, I grew up in Central Iowa, in Boone, Iowa. Went to the University of Iowa for a bachelor's and a master's in social work, came to Cedar Rapids, started a lot of things, ended up in relationship to this podcast that we're doing today in Tim Charles' office. Tim at the time was the president and CEO of Mercy Medical Center, and he was talking to me about my interest in helping the hospital look at the possibility of creating a family caregiver center. And because Dave, my husband, was living with dementia, he was diagnosed in 2003 at age 56 with the visual variant of Alzheimer's. And I had cared for him by the time Tim talked with me for 11 years. And so I had kind of had some lived experience. And when Tim said, was I interested, I said, absolutely yes, because when Dave was at home, he lived at home for 8 years, wrenched his back, went for rehab. In the process, I thought he would come back home, but I realized what I'd been doing, and he went to live at Halmar, which was at the time a residential place within Mercy. So I cared for Dave, created this committee, wondered what people in the community that didn't have the decades of social work experience that I had, what they possibly could do.
Exactly.
And we were also fortunate because we had some financial resources. And so I also would wonder, like, what do people do that they don't have some financial resources? So when Tim said, what about a caregiver center, it was like, bingo, absolutely, yes, I'll help you do it. So that really then, because of the success of the Caregiver Center, has led to the development of the DeWolf Innovation Center. So that's why I'm here.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, when you were describing that, I'm like, I'm thinking exactly the same thing. If you're someone who isn't aware of resources, doesn't have financial resources, your background was kind of the perfect preparation, if you will, for something like, not that anyone can have a perfect prep for that, obviously, but you knew of, okay, here are some things we can do.
Yes.
Here, we have some resources to fund these things for ourselves. But for those that don't, gosh, what does a person do? So the fact that you and Mr. Charles came together to start this process and create these resources and the center and the generosity of the DeWolf family as well. Wow. I mean, what a incredible, compilation of all of these things that happened. And, that just doesn't, it's like lightning in a bottle, know, it's just,
We're
it's
very
perfect.
Blessed here.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. Well, we are recording today. We have previously recorded together. So if you're listening to this episode and haven't listened to the other episode I recorded with Kathy, please go back and do so. It's a great kind of foundation for this caregiving series that we're doing here on the podcast. And we're talking about caregiving, specifically for aging people. But I think a lot of the things we're going to discuss today could apply to any type of caregiving situation. And I think we even talked before I pushed the record button, it could apply to just anybody in life. We're going to talk about managing stress, and we're going to talk about self-care. We're going to talk about communication. We're going to talk about transitions in caregiving and decision-making in caregiving. But again, I think some of the skills and things we're going to talk about today could be broadly applied, to anyone. And we're just scratching the surface here today. I want to put that disclaimer out there. I told Kathy, I said, each one of these topics could probably be its own episode. But in the interest of folks' time, what I want to stress is that while we're going to be scratching the surface here in these areas of caregiver resources and skills, the center has a wealth of resources, and we can kind of talk about that more at the end. But for people who want to learn more, to talk to someone about this, there's lots of folks out there that can help with that. So we're going to just, again, speak briefly about each of these challenges that caregivers have in this episode, and then we'll have another episode on some other areas as well. So stay tuned for that as well. So as I mentioned, today we're going to focus on self-care and stress management, communication, caregiving, transitions, and decisions. And, I think that when folks are caregiving, and maybe you can speak to this from your personal experience, you don't realize how stressed out you are, or how maybe your own health, physical, mental, emotional, all the areas of your own well-being, how it could be impacted.
Exactly. I think that often when you, especially as a spousal caregiver, as I was with Dave, you incrementally do a little more, and you don't even think about what you're doing because you just accommodate to it until at some point you go like, oh, like I said, when Dave wrenched his back and went for rehab and he was not there, that was when I had a realization of, whoa, what I had been doing, and realizing that probably I hadn't been doing very good self-care, quite honestly. Right. And so it was a new realization to me about that we needed to make some change.
Absolutely. Right. And I think, and I've heard others say that when, whether it was their care receiver went into the hospital for a bit or went into rehab, or even upon that care receiver, sadly passing away, the caregiver was kind of like, wow, what's going on here? Why am I feeling this way? I didn't realize what had happened to me over those, months or years of caregiving. So I think it's super important that we talk about this topic, because caregiving can be stressful. Let's just be honest about it. It can be difficult to practice good self-care because those things kind of fall down the priority list when you've got someone who might be dealing with maybe a chronic health condition or need lots of assistance. Even someone who doesn't need a lot of assistance, there can be some things going on. So what are some things that caregivers can do to help themselves manage their stress and practice some good self-care?
Well, what we're talking about here is we're talking about change in one's life. So there's some sort of discombobulating event that happens that throws you into a situation of having to deal with change. And what we know is change is stressful. And so you have to figure out how to kind of reorder your life And a lot of it begins with how you think about it. So when I was thinking about what we were going to talk about here, I just jotted down some things that made sense to me. And the first thing that I jotted down was your perspective. So it's easy to focus on the negatives or the losses, and I'm not suggesting that that's not real and that's not normal, but one of the things to sort of remember is all the things that are still the same, that all the things that still work while you're in the process of then figuring out how to deal with some of the things that don't work as well and that you have to accommodate to in a different kind of way.
Yes, yes.
Another thing that I tried to do when I recognized that I needed to do a better job of caring for myself was to get help, and particularly to get help with the things that somebody else could do for me that I didn't necessarily need to do for myself, so that then I would be more available to do the things with Dave that either somebody else couldn't do or that I didn't want them to do.
Sure.
And I think the other thing is because I'm a social worker by background, I'm always thinking about self-talk and what is it that you're saying to yourself. And so we listen to whatever is going on inside. We listen. And so if you're doing negative self-talk, going like, oh, I'll never be able to manage this, I'll never be able to figure this out, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, of course, you're not going to be able to figure it out because you're not even setting yourself up for that. Right. So learning how to stop that negative self-talk. Sometimes I used to, when I was teaching at Kirkwood, and this was pre-Dave, but and all of that experience with caregiving, but I used to drive from my counseling office downtown out to Kirkwood. And so when I'd be doing this negative self-talk to myself, like, well, am I going to be able to deliver this lecture, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I would hit the steering wheel and go, stop it, Kathy, stop it.
Yep.
And sometimes I go like, oh, I wonder what happens if the steering wheel falls off.
Right.
Anyway,
how am I going to drive this car if I hit it so hard?
The point I'm trying to make is that sometimes you just absolutely have to say to yourself, stop it, and think about how can you reframe that message so that you're giving yourself, just telling yourself that you are capable and that you've dealt with a lot of change, and this is different change, and so, but highly important.
Absolutely.
And I think another thing is to think about what would you say to somebody else in your situation.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
Yes,
so,
that's huge.
And then the tricky part of that is I could think about what I'd say. The hard thing is then to do it. But sometimes you just have to think, is there one little step I could take that would help me, do what it is that I would say to somebody else? Like, of course, you're entitled to ask for help. So then could I figure out one friend that I could say, could you just come over and have tea and coffee with Dave?
Yes, absolutely. And it doesn't have to be something big, right? It could be something small that, just something, could you come check the mail, or could you pick this up for me? It could just be something very
if you're going to
minor,
the store,
but it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, if you're going to the store, could you get a gallon of milk for me?
Right.
It doesn't have
drop
to be.
it off.
Yes, it doesn't have to be a big thing.
Nope.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
exactly.
And I think the other thing that I learned along the way about self-care that was helpful to me was to attempt to simplify life. So we always had done a lot of entertaining. Well, I could still do some entertaining, but I couldn't do it in the same way that I'd always done before. So figuring out how to simplify your life, and also then to establish what I used to call the good enough standard, because I'm kind of a perfectionist, but you can't be a perfectionist and do everything that you need to do as a caregiver. So you have to think about what's the good enough standard here. So I'm going to do this entertaining, but instead of cooking all the meals myself, all the food myself, I'm going to bring in takeout and put it on an elegant plate.
Right. Hey,
and
you can make a charcuterie board
that's right.
or have someone make it for you, and just, simple, easy.
Yes,
right.
Exactly. So the establishing sort of the good enough standard. So, and I think that it's also important that So when you are caring for someone and previously you've been kind of joined at the hip with them, whether that's a parent or whether that's a spouse, you can't continue that in the same sort of way because the two of you are not going down the same path as you might have been before. So you have to then figure out how do you go on with life in a little separate kind of way, making sure that you don't lose yourself in the process.
Yes.
Because it's very easy to lose your own identity in that process and become the caregiver. So one of the things that was really hard for me the first time I did it was I like to go to the theater. Dave and I went to the theater together a lot. First time I went, I couldn't even say to him I was going to the theater by myself. I had to say I'm going to a meeting. But it got easier as I practiced it, and it was really important that I continue to do those things that put gas in my tank because there were a lot of things that I was doing that drained the tank. But so you have to figure out things that will put gas in your tank.
Right. I love that point that you make because again, I think caregivers' natural tendencies is to put that down at the bottom of the priority list or even feel a little bit of guilt or, shame about doing something that they enjoy, whether it's going to the theater or gardening or going to see friends or whatever the case may be. And what people don't remember is that when you eliminate all of that from your life, you are doing so much more harm to your own well-being, but also in your ability to be the best caregiver for your care receiver that you can be. You're depriving yourself of some things that you just really enjoy. It could even just be taking a trip to the bookstore for an hour or, something really simple that, you just enjoy. And then when you come back home, you're refreshed and kind of ready to engage again. And people that just gets missed so often.
Well, and I think that if you're an adult child who is caring for a parent, sometimes it's really hard to figure out, like, where do I put my priority? And I think it's okay to put some priority on your own relationship, your spouse, and your children.
Right.
So that all of you doesn't get sort of drained by what you're doing with your caring for your parent. Not that that's not important, but I think it's tricky to figure out that balance too.
Right. And I think we have to give ourselves a lot of grace in that process, right? If you don't have it all figured out right now, that's okay. It takes time to figure out the right mix and the right balance. And you're not going to get it right all the time. And that's okay. You need to give yourself a lot of grace. And again, kind of back to your point about if you were speaking with a friend who was in your shoes, how would you speak to them? You're not going to sit there and say, well, too bad. You're just stuck with this. Good luck. You're not going to figure this out. You wouldn't speak to them the way that a lot of us speak to ourselves in those circumstances. So speak to yourself the way you would speak to a friend or, someone else going through this and be gentle with yourself.
Yes. And I think because it is sort of difficult to figure out what is the balance in life, whether you're a spousal caregiver or whether you're an adult child caregiver. And so I think that's one of the places that our Family Caregiver Center is available to all caregivers who are caring for any kind of an adult with a chronic condition. And they can kind of help you by listening and helping you sort out, let's see, how do I find that balance? And it's kind of like a fine line and kind of like walking a balance beam. It's sort of like you get too far one way, you need to come back the other way. But we have people around us and professionals and a lot of our trained volunteers that can help with that.
Right. I love that. We also wanted to touch on communication because I think it's an area, we all communicate with lots of people every single day, but I think in caregiving, it can get challenging and extra complicated because you've got a care receiver who may be struggling with a health condition. They might be struggling with something like dementia or Alzheimer's. Now you're pulling in a bunch of professionals, whether it be, physicians, therapists, other people outside of the family helping out. Maybe you have someone coming into the home to help you. So there's communication there that needs to happen. You've got siblings, other family members. The list goes on and on, right? So there's a lot of things happening around communication that can be a little extra challenging in caregiving. So I would love to know any thoughts you would have about how to help caregivers think about communications and some important pieces there.
Well, I think that one of the things that comes into place are the changing roles that occur. So usually when roles change, you need to think about your communication and how that changes. And I think oftentimes when we're talking about adult children who become caregivers, sometimes the literature even, and I really dislike it, where it says, well, now you become the parent. Well, you don't, from my perspective, you really don't become the parent. You certainly are interacting with your parents in a different kind of way, but because they have lived experience that children do not, you cannot deal with them as children.
Right.
And so you need to join with them. And the idea is that what you want to do is to encourage somebody's independence as long as you can. So we don't do that necessarily by taking over or by telling people. We figure out how to have a conversation maybe that we would want somebody to have with us.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
That joins with the person and enlists their ideas about whatever the topic is. And then it's really important to listen to that. And one of the notes that you made that you sent to me was about reflective listening. And I think reflective listening is such a basically human tool that we all need to practice. And that is that when somebody talks, they are talking about not just the content, but they're talking about how they feel. And so when you're talking with, whether it's somebody, your spouse that has a chronic condition, or your parents that have a chronic condition, or they're older and you're wanting them to do something, to enlist them and get them talking, and then to reflect back both what you're picking up in terms of what they're saying, but also how they feel. Exactly. And that goes a long way sometimes to facilitate communication, particularly in a close interpersonal relationship.
I completely agree. And I think that reflective listening, that kind of, oh, this is what I heard you say.
Yes.
And, and it sounds like you're feeling frustrated, or you're feeling alone, or whatever the situation could be, is so powerful. And as you mentioned, it's great in any area of life, but I think in terms of caregiving, it's so powerful. And also with, the caregiver and care receiver, but also with other family members that may be involved, because that starts to get really tricky a lot of times, because everybody has their own perspective on things and how things should be. And I want to encourage people too, who maybe you're not actively caregiving for someone right now. You might, have maybe parents who are getting older, but you're not actively caregiving. Now is a great time to sit down and have a conversation and say, hey, this has been on my mind. I'm listening to this podcast and I'd like to talk with you about some future things and just understand what their wishes might be a little bit. And, gosh, as you guys continue to get older, do you guys have any thoughts or preferences around where you want to live, or what, those sorts of things? Because as someone ages, or as the caregiving thing, situation and roles and relationships evolve and change, that can be more difficult,
Absolutely.
Or you find yourself in like a crisis situation where, you haven't had those conversations and you don't know what someone might want, or they're not able to express it to you. And then what, So I really think it's powerful to have the conversations early if you can, if you're able. Now, if you're in the midst of it, you're in the thick of it, and it's not too late, obviously, of course, but this is a great time to get started talking about these things and practice that reflective listening, so that when the time does come, you're really, you've got it ingrained and you're good at it, and it helps you. So
I think that, and I don't know whether you'll include this as a link, but there's something called the Conversation Project.
Ooh, Oh,
And
tell me about
if
that.
you Google that, or maybe you can put the link in your podcast.
I'll put that in the show notes.
I think that really talks about how to start conversations with someone particularly like your parents, or even with a spouse, in terms of all of those significant things that need to be discussed that make caregiving easier, that make just getting older easier.
Right. I love that. I will link that in the show notes. So if folks want to check that out, they can certainly click on that link and do that for sure. Something else that I've found to be helpful, again, in just communication in general, but I think in caregiving, is using what are called iMessages, right? So when we're having a conversation, I think especially one that might be a little more emotional, maybe highly charged, type of conversation, I think it's easy to go into the mode of, well, you never told me mom wanted this. And so you, whereas what you want to try to do to help with folks not feeling maybe attacked or defensive or something is to use an iMessage, which is basically you saying something more to the effect of, I felt frustrated when I found out that mom wanted this as opposed to that. Or, I put it more on how you felt about the situation and not pointing the finger at the other person. I think this happens a lot with maybe siblings in caregiving or, other family members who are helping and might have a different perspective on how something should be done, or maybe you have, someone coming into the home and maybe they don't do something that you would like them to do, or they don't do it the way you would like to do it. Say, I really, I felt this because so-and-so fell and
Yes.
So that also takes practice too, just like the reflective listening, it takes practice. But what I think that those iMessages do is that they respect the other person's feelings. So you're not attacking them. You're also being clear and specific about how the situation made you feel. You also, need to speak to the person involved. So don't go around, to someone else and said, well, Kathy did this and I'm upset and, that sort of thing. So I think it really helps to keep the conversation straightforward. It helps to keep things moving forward in the conversation and keeps that, defensiveness out of it. And again, we're not all going to be good at this the first time we try it, but I think it does merit some practice and, to help us with the people that we're communicating with. The other thing too, I think is important is to be assertive, not aggressive. And there's a difference, right? So aggressive is kind of that more attacking, accusatory kind of tone. You didn't pick up, you didn't set up mom's grocery order to be delivered and now she doesn't have any food or, whatever it is. And you want to be more assertive in your communication, kind of the take it down a little bit and be more assertive, using those iMessages. All of that kind of ties together to kind of help communication be productive.
Yes.
And not combative and just frustrating all around for everybody involved.
Absolutely. I ditto to everything you just said.
Yeah. And again, you're not going to get it perfectly every time, but the more you can practice some things, it's going to help in these times of caregiving and all that comes with that. And last on this topic that I want on the communication side of things, sometimes it's okay to have a third party facilitate some communication.
Absolutely.
Sometimes there's some really big decisions that need to happen in caregiving, and we may all, and our family members may not be equipped to have a conversation that's productive. And so, I think whether someone at the center could facilitate, or maybe you have a family friend who's kind of neutral, or maybe you have a person at your place of worship that could help facilitate something to help everybody communicate with each other in a more productive way, so that you all walk out of the room still, close and friendly and family and all of the things, and so, because some of these decisions in caregiving are tough and we all just don't know how to have those conversations maybe without a little support.
Absolutely. One of the things that we do at the Family Caregiver Center is to have family meetings. And one of the things that's really important, and I think that helps to sort of resolve any kind of conflict is for everybody to at least feel that they're heard and understood. Because usually that's where we always need to start, and that's where it goes back to the reflective listening, is if you feel heard and understood, then you're oftentimes more able to resolve conflict than if you don't feel like somebody gets it.
100%.
What's happening with you.
Yes, I could not agree more. I think if everyone is seen, everyone is heard, and feels as such,
included,
it will make that whole process so much easier for everyone involved. And not that it's easy, but it just maybe doesn't have to be as difficult.
Yes, and sometimes it just doesn't work because somebody, no matter how much you try and hear and understand, for whatever good reason, they're not able to participate. So it's not like if you just do this, you're going to have total 100% success.
Right.
But you're going to have more success by doing what we're talking about than if you don't do that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Completely agreed. Last but not least, I wanted to touch on caregiving transitions and decisions. There's some real, as I just mentioned, some big decisions, some big transitions that happen in caregiving, and it can really change relationships. It can change roles a little bit. What advice would you have for caregivers as they're navigating through this and are faced with some of those complicated, kind of tough decisions in caregiving? Do you have anything that you would want them to know going into that?
Well, I think that the first thing I want to say is there's no perfect process. Okay. So there's no rule book. You can't get the book out and say, well, if I do A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, it's all going to be great.
Yep.
Because it's so individualized. And you also have to remember it is a process. So it isn't like some of these decisions you're going to be able to have one meeting with somebody or gather one piece of information and be able to make decisions. And usually the earlier you get started in terms of gathering information, and so often we sit and we think we know, but I'm always encouraging people to say, so let's say you're thinking about making a transition from somebody being in their own home to moving out of their home, or and what is that process? And so learning to figure out, like, is there a continuum? So before you actually thought about moving out of their own home, is there a way to bring people in? And is there able to, utilize community resources in various kinds of ways, day centers or other kinds of things? But then that, as you think about what that process is, that you go and you get information from community resources, you get information from senior living communities, and that there are questions that you can ask in all these situations to learn more about what is sort of involved in that. So it's kind of like getting yourself informed.
Right.
So that the more you know, the easier it is. Never will be easy, but it's easier.
Definitely.
And I think that when you're caregiving with someone, the more that you can keep them as independent as possible, because nobody likes losing their independence. Nobody wants to become dependent. And the other thing that is, I think that is important is to the extent that it's possible and feasible, that you do this with the person, not
to them.
Right. Yes.
Right.
With them, not to them. Yes. Exactly. So those are kind of some things that come to my mind when you think about how to make that process better. And of course, I'll go back and I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record.
It's okay.
But at the Family Caregiver Center,
yes. Well, that's what I think we
have
need to
trained
share.
volunteers and our staff who are really able to sit down with somebody and help them figure out a process, figure out a plan, figure out where can they go for information. We have lists of resources, community resources, that we can say any kind of major transition or issue that you're dealing with, we probably can help you figure out like some steps to take that will make it easier. Never easy, but easier.
Right. Well, and again, I think that's what's so important about this series, is pointing people to the center, to the resources, so that they know they're not alone here. They don't have to be the expert here. We have this incredible resource here. And as you mentioned on the previous episode, it is available to anyone,
yes,
whether you live here in Eastern Iowa. We're blessed where we can physically go right here in our community to the center, but it's available to anyone. So if you're listening, in New York or Texas or Wyoming or wherever, you can call in and set a Zoom appointment and talk with somebody. So we don't have to go this alone. Most of us haven't done a lot of this type of caregiving before. So we need assistance. We cannot expect ourselves to know these things inherently, just magically somehow. Even with everything on the internet, I think a lot of folks, I'll just Google it, and yes, there's tons on the internet that can help you learn and get started. But I think there's also a lot of power in speaking to someone about it.
Yes, and we also can help caregivers find trusted resources, because sometimes it's hard to know when you're looking at the internet, is this a trusted resource or not?
Right.
And I think that I want to speak to caregivers who maybe are thinking, well, I ought to be able to do this on my own. And it's really interesting, because when we're raising children, it never would occur to us that we should always do this on our own.
No.
But we reach out and we get babysitters and we get daycare, and we ask for help. We ask for our neighbor to, could we carpool? So it's really interesting that at that end of the spectrum, we find it much easier, and we feel much more entitled to sort of reach out and ask for help, even though probably at the other end it's more difficult.
It's much more layered and complex.
Yes, because probably
elder caregiving,
the person being cared for is in a declining situation, not in a growing situation as children are.
100%. I completely agree. I really do. I think a lot of us feel like, well, I'm an adult. I should be able to figure this out. Right. I should know how to do this. And it's like, no, you don't. And you don't have to know. And there's people that can help you, and they want to help. They want to help you through this. A couple other points on these transitions and big decisions. You kind of mentioned this too a little bit, but that just acknowledging that these things take time, right? That you're not going to figure out a living situation in one discussion, right? If you may need to move someone from their home into a different location, those things are going to take time, and that's okay, right? You're dealing with something pretty, it's got some magnitude with it, and so it just takes time. Also, I think acknowledging that, there could be setbacks in some of these big decisions, and they can be temporary setbacks, and hopefully not permanent, but just hopefully if a setback occurs, it's temporary. Don't get stuck in that. And also acknowledge what you have done. I think a lot of people feel like, oh, well, we weren't able to keep mom at home because of this, and they feel bad about that. And it's like, but think about all the things you've done leading up into that, and all the work you've done to get her into this new apartment or facility or whatever it is where she's at, acknowledging that, and just understanding that all of this, you have the person's best interests in mind, right. and you are going to make the best decision with the information you have and the guidance you receive, and you should be, you need to acknowledge that about yourself, that you've not just willy-nilly kind of made some decision flippantly. Well, here, we'll just put mom over here. Well, no, we're going to research. We're going to get some input. We're going to look at things. We're going to talk. I even think about driving too is another big one that I feel like people are really nervous about dealing with as another big transition for folks. And again, I think in that one too, especially involving that care receiver as much as humanly possible, because they don't want to be dependent on others, right. And taking away their ability to drive a vehicle is a big loss of autonomy and independence for them. So that's another one that always comes to my mind. And it's not going, like you said, there isn't a perfect process. There's going to be bumps and hills and valleys along the way, and that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kathy, this has been great. Thank you so much. Again, we know we have just kind of scratched the surface. So if you're someone who's anticipating caregiving, in the midst of it. I will link again in the show notes, the Chris and Suzy DeWolf Family Innovation Center for dementia and aging. There's so many services there. But again, I think a great first step would just be to reach out and meet with someone and talk to them, share your situation, and have them help you sort things out. And again, focusing on these areas, communication, making decisions, and almost just as important as all of these things, if not more important, taking care of yourself, is so important during this time. And I know it's easier said than done, but it's so crucial and so important. So thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I've enjoyed it.
If you're enjoying the podcast, please follow the show to make sure the latest episode is on your podcast feed each week. I would greatly appreciate a rating and a 5-star review on the podcast platform you're listening on. It helps others to find the show. If there are topics you'd like me to discuss on the show, please email me at themarvelousmiddleagepodcast@gmail.com or direct message me on Instagram at Nicole Stute. Thank you for listening.